Hello, welcome again to a new edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. We are now in October, so this is the October show, and I'm in a slightly different location to the locations I normally am, and using my laptop. The reason being that this time of the year, the light starts to fade as we're doing the show. So I hope you like the white background. It's also going to be quite fascinating because the sun keeps coming out, so if sometimes I'm sort of bathed in a blinding light, it's not because there's been some kind of revelation from on high. It is simply that the sun is shining in my eyes and I will blink massively. Today's show is going to be an extremely informal one, and it's going to be a wonderful opportunity for me to interview somebody that has interviewed me many times, and it's the great and wonderful Miguel Connor. Miguel and I have been in contact now for probably about 8 years, and we used to do a show together called Schrodinger's Diary, which we are thinking about starting up again as well. And Miguel runs a website called The God Above God and Aeon Byte. Check out his work. Some of his material is absolutely fantastic. And as we were just discussing off air, he has the most incredible deep voice. I was suggesting to him that if Eddie Vedder ever retired from Pearl Jam, I'm sure that Miguel could just walk in there and he could do it. You know, it's like deep coffee. It really is to go wading through it. But one of these things. And of course, as always, we've got Dia in the background down in Denver, and Miguel is joining us from Chicago. So we've got hands across the Atlantic again. Also, one of the things to let you guys know is that I now have a brand spanking website, and all of these are now going up. Each of these shows are now posted on there, and you have a whole history of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour in there, so you can check out some of the amazing guests we've had. This particular show, I'm going to get Miguel to tell me a little bit about himself. I mean, for me, he's somebody I've chatted with many times, but he's still a man of mystery. He's this kind of interesting half Portuguese, half Irish, swashbuckling Gnostic that lives this incredibly wild life. We recently did a show together on his show, and one of the things that everybody missed was normally Miguel does these amazing introduction talks, which if you ever get the chance to listen to them, he's absolutely terrifying. They could use him as this kind of talk over for some kind of Satanist something or other. But Miguel is an absolute expert on Gnosticism. So this is the opportunity for us to understand a little bit more about exactly what Gnosticism is and exactly what brought Miguel into this business. So Miguel, without further ado, welcome to the Consciousness Hour.
Oh, it's an honor being here, Anthony. I've been listening to this for years, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that so far no Archons have visited. I think that's our little private joke of many years, and it's not so funny most of the time when they strike. But, yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm not that interesting. I'm actually one of the most boring people you'll ever meet. I don't drink, I don't eat meat, I don't go out, I don't swear, I put my audio in my introductions to do the swearing. So I'm a very boring guy. 5 kids, day job, nothing exciting. But again, it's our ideas that make us exciting, then make us dangerous, right?
Absolutely, because funnily enough, the sun has just come out into my eyes, so I'm looking really weird. So again, this is not at all surprising. Miguel and I have had this running joke for an awful long time, which people who listen to me on or follow me on Facebook will know this, that we have this term, the Archons, and the Archons do tend to manifest themselves in the most wonderful ways. And I guarantee that Dearda in the background is also nodding away, saying that we get the Archons on here as well. So it's a running theme. But for the opportunity, Miguel, if you can tell us a little bit about the boring life you've lived up to here, but why it is that this very ordinary character from Chicago became interested in Gnosticism. What is it that interested you in Gnosticism and started your interest? And if you continue talking while I just go away and get the sun out of my eyes, so if you can just chat, I will disappear for just a second.
Sure, no problem, Anthony. Well, I think when I'm talking about Gnosticism, of course, the first reference I always bring up is the Matrix. I mean, that when people want to know about Gnosticism, I just say, if you've watched the Matrix, you've got Gnosticism, and I can fill in any blanks you might have, especially with the historical Gnostics. But so going to that, I think the character Morpheus tells Neo in one scene, there's something wrong with the world, but you just don't know what it is. It's like a splinter in your mind driving you mad. And as growing up, as many esoteric-minded artists and so forth, I was always very restless. I always felt that, again, there was something wrong with the world, and there was a splinter that often caused a lot of havoc growing up. And there was always hints of Gnosticism, things that touched me as I grew up. For example, I always tell people that Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits is one of my all-time favorite movies, and it's obviously very Monty Python-esque, but it basically deconstructed the universe. And as watching it as a 10-year-old, it just hit me, A, maybe the Supreme Being isn't in charge, and B, the universe is maybe just a big mess, a big illusion, a big hologram. And of course, growing up, there were always other things that I was interested in: Dungeons and Dragons, reading a lot of science fiction, and of course, being very interested in mythology and so forth. But again, that sense of there's something wrong with the world always stayed with me. And like many of us, I went through many journeys, wore different religions, practiced different rituals, joined different philosophies, radical political groups, all looking for answers. And it was only later in life, probably in my 30s, that I got interested, I'd heard about Gnosticism through, of course, the Da Vinci Code. I had seen The Matrix, and it blew me away, seen a lot of Gnostic theme movies like The Truman Show and so forth. But back then it was sort of couched in most scholars would, like Elaine Pagels and so forth, always refer to the Gnostics as sort of alternative mystic Christians. And I was like, at the time I was Catholic, I was like, well, that's fine. I'm sort of an alternative mystic Christian, even though I'm Catholic, so I don't see what's the big deal about it. And I still became interested, started studying Gnosticism, and it was okay, but it really was a sort of our mutual friend, Philip K. Dick, who was the red pill, you might say, the Morpheus in my book, in my life. When I read Valis, I think that's when, you might say, the red pill really went down my throat. That's when the light bulb just exploded, and I realized, oh my God, these ancient heretics do have something, there's something about them, because after all, the Gnostics did contend that we really do live in an illusionary world. You might say not a nice, like Hindu illusion, but sort of a dark hologram. And that all the rulers of this universe, the gods or whatever you want to call them, really are deficient, and so are their servants in the establishment. And the Gnostics were really the first people in history to really stand up to them. I mean, they, as some have said, they had that punk rock mentality. They put their foot down really hard. In the times of Jesus, you had tens of thousands of what you might call of obedience and covenant religion. Basically, humans didn't question the gods. They didn't question the representatives, the kings or the priests. They might question the other religions, but everybody was sort of in their own silos. The Gnostics were so radical that 2,000 years ago, they said, no. All these gods, all these constructs of the cosmos, all these systems are deficient. There's a higher, you might say, intelligence above everything that nobody has ever heard of, and I call them the alien god. And this being was complete consciousness, complete good, complete love. And the Gnostics, through this process called gnosis, felt that they could make contact with God, and they could go in through these ecstatic, shamanistic rituals and commune with this God and sort of break away, be transformed into Neo or Morpheus or one of those guys, be these really cool agents that were beyond the touch of the rulers of this world. And to me, that was really, truly, it was truly admirable how they stood up, how they found these intuitions. And of course, this ties in perfectly with your paradigm, Anthony, because after all, you could switch it all around. You could say, well, the Gnostics felt that their their eidolons were deficient. They weren't getting the job done. They felt contact with this daemon, this higher intelligence or higher consciousness beyond everything, beyond the hologram that is the whole universe, and their idea was through gnosis, through knowledge, to make contact with the daemon and unify with them. So to me, that was also, and of course there's a lot of things that I liked about the Gnostics. Their ideas that they were so radical, so radically ahead of the times when it came to the feminine aspects. They saw Mary Magdalene as a leader. They saw reverence and the divine feminine. They believed that those who joined their lodges and so forth, whether they were men or women, had the same, more or less the same rights. They could baptize, they could hold ceremonies, they could practice in the ceremonial magic and so forth. And these were all things that were they're fascinating about the Gnostics. And as I study them, they become even more interested with all the different sects. And I would even say that the Gnostics, and I've said this on my show many times, and this has been agreed by many other, you might say, occult writers, from Chris Knowles to Gordon White and others, but we really do, the Gnostic sensibility, just like I feel your ideas of the daemon and Eidolon and alternative sides are more important than ever, because let's face it, we do live in a time where being paranoid, we're being highly suspicious, we're being very counterculture intellectually is very hip, because nobody trusts reality anymore. It seems that everything is questioned, everything is deficient, and there seems to be a man behind the curtain, behind that curtain, a demiurge behind everything, which is the Gnostics, who saw the ultimate archon, who they associated with the God of the Old Testament. And of course, as Tessa Dick once said, we do live in a Philip K. Dick world, and I think she's 100% right. I mean, Dick's ideas seem to be not even prophetic, but they seem to be true and trendy. Again, that sense of paranoia, that sense that we're being controlled by men in black, that sense that all of our establishment churches, political groups are really in on it in some massive cosmic con game, and we're trying to get through different levels of reality just mostly to find ourselves, because as the Gnostics, as Carl Jung said, they were the history's first depth psychologists. In the Gnostic voyage, you went through shamanistic rituals, but the journey towards God, towards the ultimate source, really started from within. They were obsessed with going within and breaking down the different capacities of the mind. It seems that they saw Jesus really not as a historical personage, but they saw him as a capacity of the mind, the consciousness that had fallen into the flesh and gone through some trauma and now needed to sort of shorn all of it and go back beyond. So all these things really fascinate me, and I think I've talked a lot, Anthony. I hope I haven't babbled too much.
Far from it. No, it's exactly what I was hoping you'd do. Now, in terms of the Gnostics themselves, how do we know about them, and indeed what happened to them? We know that they were around about the 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the death of Christ. But how do we know? What is the historical aspects of where they went and what they did, and how Gnosticism has ended up to this day? So a very quick historical analysis, really right through to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, would be really interesting. So I'll just sit back and listen, because I know that you know this stuff to such an extent.
Yeah, I would. First of all, I'm going to say it might be sort of a straw man finding their origins, because as some scholars have said, the Gnosticism wasn't a religion. It was sort of a metaphysical orientation, a new form of spirituality, or a sort of philosophy that said, again, we are ruled by deficient gods, and there are slaves in the establishment. We live in an illusionary world, and we must make contact to this otherness beyond us, this ultimate consciousness. So it's hard to say, because this sort of thinking, after years of covenant and obedience worship, was really radical, and it's almost like it seemed that at some point, especially in those days of, let's say, the early days of Jesus, or even before that with Alexandria and Athens, this sort of like binary reaction would have happened, where people would have said, wait a second, there's something wrong with the world, you just don't know what it is, and that splinter in their heads would have woken woken up. But as far as we can tell, it's not. Some scholars do contend that the Gnostics might have started before even Jesus, that it might have started with the Hermetic tradition in Alexandria, because after all, as research has shown us, the Hermetic tradition was heavily based on ancient Egyptian mystery rites, and the Hermetics sort of took that and couched it in a sort of a middle Platonic model, which happened again even before the time of Jesus. And some scholars have said that what happened was there were dissatisfied Greek Jews who were tired of the corrupt temple culture. They were tired of Jerusalem. They were tired of Yahweh sort of giving them promises and letting them down. They were tired of the state of being under the yoke of the Roman Empire, and sort of broke away, very much like the Dead Sea Scrolls community. And these Jews broke away and started sort of their own shamanistic, ecstatic rites. They started adopting Platonic philosophy. They started adopting ancient Egyptian magic, and they sort of also Zoroastrian dualism, Babylonian astrology, and sort of created their own systems, all to gain that gnosis, all to support this idea of these flights beyond the universe, beyond the stars, to make contact with this alien god. And at some point, these Gnostics became Christianized. They adopted the figure of the Gnostic revealer, or you might say Morpheus Jesus. Then they took him and drew him and adapted him to their scriptures, just as they adapted a lot of other characters like Seth, Melchizedek, Hermes Trismegistos, and so forth. So Gnosticism basically thrived probably in the 2nd century, and it immediately became a threat to the nascent Christian church. They spent a lot of energy creating polemics against the Gnostics, and these are all attested by the church fathers. I don't want to get too long, but at some point, obviously, as Christianity coalesced within the Roman Empire, the Gnostics began to be squeezed out. We do have writings of persecution, destruction of Gnostic churches, and so forth. What happened as Rome became fully Christianized and the Gnostics, you might say, lost, was that you had the Manichaeans, which was a religion founded on this figure called Mani, and it was very Gnostic. It was, you might say, like all the other Gnostics religions, it had a sort of a parasitic quality. It adopted the culture and religion around them and then made it its own to promote this viewpoint of gnosis and transcending the world. So the Mani, of course, adopted a lot of the Persian. He was from Persia, a lot of the Zoroastrian models, and he molded it with Christianity. And as the Manichaeans spread, and what most people don't know is that the Manichaeans were really the first ever global religion. Towards the early Middle Ages, you had Manichaeans all the way to China. In fact, to this day, there are some temples where Buddhists go and they worship the Mani because they see him as a Buddha of light. And it spread all the way to Western Europe. But, of course, as always, the radical, countercultural, punk rock message of the Gnostics never went well with any of the secular or religious authorities. So the Manichaeans, from Asia to pagan countries to Christian countries, they were persecuted pretty violently. They were able to last about probably 1,000 years, Middle Ages, the middle of the Middle Ages, but eventually it petered out. What we do know is that the Manichaean influence, as far as we can tell, probably spread through Europe through the Bogomils. That's where we get the word buggering from, the Bogomils, because it was, again, a nasty term, turning it around. And then spread to the Cathars, those famed heretics from southern France, from Languedoc, which appear in the Da Vinci Code and in other, might say, romantic novels. And towards the 13th century, the Cathars became a threat to the church, and the church instituted the first ever crusade against Christians, because the Cathars were Christians. They just had a very Gnostic point of view. The world was ruled by Satan. They believed in reincarnation. Mary Magdalene was a superior, and so forth. The church established a brutal crusade against the Cathars and basically exterminated them. And actually, the Inquisition began in those times at first against the Cathars. then it spread towards Jews, women, and pagans, and so forth. So the First Inquisition was actually created to expunge the Cathars from the Catholic Church and from Europe. And from that, it seems the Gnostics sort of, but of course, it's sort of, you might say that the Gnostic ideas might have spread towards other, you might say, alternative Christianities like the Anabaptists and so forth. But the other group that does survive is the Mandeans, and the Mandeans are a Gnostic sect in Iraq. Some of you might have heard them in the news, along with the Yazidi and others, that they've been brutally persecuted, not only by ISIS, but before by, other Muslims. Saddam Hussein allowed them to stay, but once in a while he would persecute them. And the Mandeans are a Middle East sect that probably started around the 2nd or 3rd century. And again, they have very Gnostic ideas. They are also very radical. The Gnostics are very famous for switching characters, just to see what happened. We don't know why. I mean, there's obviously probably reasons that have to do with culture and reaction. But, for example, the classic Gnostics might have wrote about Judas or Cain in a positive light. The classic Gnostics saw the people from Sodom and Gomorrah as good people who needed to be saved. The Gnostics saw Noah and Moses as sort of jerks, and they sort of rooted against them and for the Egyptians and so forth. In fact, the Mandeans, they saw Ham as sort of the good guy in the Noah myth. That's when Noah curses Ham, even though Noah was naked drinking. They saw Ham as sort of the father of their people. And the Mandeans, again, very interesting Gnostic sect, has survived to this day. They are still they're hanging on in Iraq, although a lot of groups have moved to Australia and Canada and thriving. So the Mandeans, you might say, are the last unbroken lineage of Gnostics. But of course, there's been revivals. I mean, we know that, for example, there was a French Gnostic revival probably in the 19th century that adopted a lot of the ancient Valentinian customs, and that became popularized. We know there's a Gnostic Mass in the Crowley systems and the OTO, and we know that a lot of Gnostic ideology survived through the secret societies. It was always sort of an inspiration to them to have that Gnostic, to preserve the Gnostic philosophy and sort of be inspired by the Gnostic rebellion against things. We know that, for example, Herman Melville and Franz Kafka were influenced a bit by Gnostic ideas and so forth. And, of course, we have William Blake, Philip K. Dick. We could go on and on. So that was more than brief, Anthony, and I apologize. But that's sort of a historical cap of the Gnostics. I can't hear you.
Sorry, that's my fault. I didn't actually. I was on mute for a second there.
You were the Archon.
I was the Archon myself. Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes wonder about that. One of the areas that fascinated me with Gnosticism when I first came across it, which was probably comparatively late in my own intellectual career, was probably around about 15 years ago. And it was the Tim Freak book and Peake Gandhi book, The Jesus Mysteries. And I found that book intriguing because it answered, and the Gnostic theology answered a lot of the questions that I had asked from a child, in that I could never understand the existence of evil, why evil existed in the world when supposedly it had been created by a good God. I now know that is theodicy, isn't it? It is the concept of how could a good God give a child cancer, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But of course the answer is that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, that was smiting and doing all these terrible things to everybody, it seemed, and if you got upset, he would turn around and he would say, I am a jealous God. And of course that's a contradiction in terms, how can a God be jealous? And these were the questions, as I recall, that the Gnostics asked. And they said, well, if he is not the real God, what is he? Is he some other kind of creator that believes he's the real God, but he isn't, and there's a God behind. So what I'd like you to do now is to explain a little bit to the audience the concept of the demiurge, the concept of the half-creator, the concept of how Gnostic theology gets over this problem of theodicy.
Yes, and this is again how rebellious, you might say, the Gnostics were. The concept of the demiurge is actually in Platonic idea, and even in Greco-Roman times, was actually very positive. I mean, Plato, he writes, I think it's in the Timaeus, he writes how you have the one, you have the ultimate consciousness, which really is just there. It's ultimate consciousness. But you have this demiurge that sort of puts form into some of the chaos that's around the ultimate form and creates the world and sort of manages the world benignly. And again, this was a positive idea. I mean, one thing that annoyed the Neoplatonists like Plotinus was the fact that the Gnostics had turned the demiurge into a bad guy and sort of this bully buffoon, this sort of almost demon-like creature. And that annoyed me. And even in Christian times, Justin Martyr actually calls Jesus the demiurge of Yahweh. He was the forming thought of the universe. But the Gnostics were going to have none of it because they looked at the world. Like you said, they began to see things like disease and the platypus or whatever you want, old age, the suffering, the samsara of this world. And they came to the conclusion that this world was being managed at some point by, again, deficient divine beings or deficient intelligence. And of course, coming from the Judeo-Christian matrix, they assumed, and looking at the Old Testament, they assumed, well, it looks like maybe Yahweh isn't the top guy as much as he likes to say it. And they began to sort of doing their own exegesis, their own interpretations about the creation before creation. And they began, and again, a lot of this is through insight, mystical flights, meditation, contemplation. And they saw this sort of a demon-like creature that had been born through, in a lot of they had different stories, so that's true. There's no Gnostic stories the same because they're playing it fast and loose with mythology. They're trying to find insights into their own minds and their own thinking and their own emotions. You might say they're almost like giant myth koans, but in the Gnostic models, a lot of them, you have, again, the one, the ultimate intelligence, the alien God. Some called it depths in silence, the supreme mother and father. And obviously, as it became conscious, it began to create, or it began to understand each other itself, and it started to create modes of intelligence or personification of its abilities, goodness, kindness, order, and so forth. And at one point in some of the Gnostic myths, is how they explain creation, the farthest aeon, they call these modes of intelligence, these personhood, these aspects of the alien God, aeons. One of the aeons was called Sophia, the wisdom of God. And again, they don't agree, but it seems she wanted to understand the ultimate source. She'd gotten so far away, she wanted to understand the ultimate source. And being wisdom, she was going to find out, because that was her nature. You're not going to stop wisdom from finding out what she wants to find out. So she actually broke the system. She disobeyed. She didn't stay in her own place, and she fell from the pleroma, a term you know very well, which is, again, the totality, the real reality, the mind of God, or the ultimate consciousness in pure perfection, and pure idealized perfection and information. She fell, and as she fell in the chaos, you might say that her emotions, her fears, they call it the passion of Sophia, her emotions gave birth to the universe. In some, it's almost like she had an abortion, or she had a period, and the material universe appeared. And one of the things that she created was the demiurge, which is basically a representation of her insecurities, her desires, her disobedience. And this being the demiurge, who they called Yaldabaoth or Samael, the blind god, and other names, this being became the creator of the universe, who shaped the universe, and they associated Yaldabaoth again with the God of the Old Testament, and so forth. So that's what we have it. And Again, to be specific, this is, again, the Gnostics were using mythology to explain existentialist realities. I seriously doubt, like Plato and Aristotle, that they took any of it literally. I mean, who knows, right? We'll find out. But this was all sort of allegory in order to find out why we are here, why our minds are like here. And of course they understood that there's an otherness out there that's pretty apparent from your research, from the research of all these great scholars like Eric. There is something out there. It's just our minds are still trying to figure that out through the right data and the right exercises. So, but to the Gnostics, the ultimate mind, the pleroma, was pure information. I think Philip K. Dick talks about the plasmate. It is pure information. It's not a thing of power. It's not a thing of materiality. It's information that can come down to us like a red pill, like being downloaded into the matrix. And it's about waking up to our reality and finding how to reconnect with the higher reality. That's why I always tell listeners, look, the alien god's not going to cure your cancer or raise your cat from the dead or anything like that, or give you maybe the lottery number, but I doubt it. But because this is pure transformative information, and to it, matter is just an illusion. It's painful, it's horrible, it is what it is. Not all Gnostics saw the universe as negative. Some actually saw it as positive, but it's not home, and it's a matter of getting that information to get home.
One of the things that has long intrigued me again about Gnosticism is this idea that everything in its final analysis is information, because the latest research that is being done in terms of cosmology and the latest work that's been put together by Stephen Hawking and his associate Thomas Hertog is suggesting that in its base form, everything that is a form of information, and it is to do in some way with black holes and loss of information within black holes. And there has been recent work done by a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in the States, who's been suggesting that they have been able to discover now the fine-tuning and the digitization of the universe itself. So here we have these guys from many, many years ago that seem to be carrying a deep truth that was powerful and very, very persuasive for many, many people. But they seem to sort of go into slight obscurity. And then there was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Nag Hammadi Library.
And the Nag Hammadi Library. Would you like to explain a little bit about that, of how this reintroduced to the Western world the culture and environment of the Gnostics themselves?
Yeah, I mean, before in the 19th century and before, we only had a few Gnostic texts. There was sort of the Pistis Sophia, we had the Gospel of Mary, there was some, I believe there was a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, and a few other texts, but that was it. And we also had the writings of the Church Fathers, but of course, a lot of scholars didn't really want to hitch their wagons to the words of the Church Fathers, because after all, the Church Fathers were going around saying, beyond what the Gnostics wrote, they were saying they were doing these horrible things. They were libertine, they were immoral, or they were just the Church Fathers weren't very nice. They were very sarcastic and polemical to the Gnostics. But what happened is around in 1945 in Upper Egypt, they discovered, you might say, a trove of Gnostic texts in a jar, and there's different stories what happened. But they were able to discover these texts and translate them. In fact, Carl Jung himself was able to get one of the first copies, the Gospel of Truth, from the Nag Hammadi Library. But eventually all these texts were put together and translated and published in 1979 as the Nag Hammadi Library. And all of a sudden we had a lot of material on what the Gnostics actually said or what they believed. And some of it is fascinating, because even in the 2nd century, you have church fathers like Irenaeus quoting the secret book of John and the Gospel of, didn't quote it, but meant the Gospel of Judas and all these texts. And suddenly in the Nag Hammadi Library, you have those texts, you have those quotes. So some of what the church fathers said was accurate to an extent. They weren't, they were actually doing their due diligence. But beyond that, we were able to see a lot of the different Gnostic sects, what they believe, the stories of Sophia exactly happened. Not only that, but a lot of the texts do have at least they have the writings on the rituals, the invocations for their magical rituals. These long texts where they're doing all these vowel sounds and invoking different gods and spirits, so they can again go through their ecstatic initiation. We don't know exactly what they did physically to an extent, but we do know we have a lot of their spells and their meditations and invocations. And it's funny because I was talking to a scholar in a lot of the Gnostic texts. There's actually, you're doing an invocation and suddenly you're supposed to do a snoring sound. It's written there, the snoring sound, like, and you wonder, well, these guys wanted to fall asleep. It was that boring sitting in one. But no, the Gnostics believe, again, they wanted to get into sort of this hypnagogic state between sleep and awake, which wasn't that uncommon in those times. And then they wanted to allow their sort of higher selves to leave their body and go traveling. So the Nag Hammadi library has been, it's been very useful to understand not only the Gnostics, but ancient Christian, early Christian culture. And as I see it, the work has really only begun. I mean, in 1979, we had our published only the English version, and there's a lot of books. I forget how many, like 60-something. So it's almost like when you think how many centuries it takes scholars to decipher the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim text, it's Gnostic studies has only begun, and it's I think it's very exciting.
It certainly is, and I think these days there seems to be, as you intimated at the start of the interview, that there is this movement within Hollywood and within modern novels whereby we're starting to now play around with the idea of realities behind realities. And we, as we've mentioned earlier on, Philip K. Dick is a classic example of this, and the movie The Matrix is a classic example of this. But there almost seems to be a kind of a Weltgeist taking place here, where people are starting to question very, very deeply exactly what the true nature of reality is. Now, if we start looking into neurology and we start looking into neurochemistry and everything else, we start to realize that our appreciation of external reality is presented to us by our conscious, by something within the brain that takes the external information, processes it, and presents it to something inside the head. But this is a great mystery, and we have this belief system within modern science that we understand exactly what is taking place in this magical process, but we don't. We understand to a degree the mechanism whereby the information is processed, but we don't understand how the brain creates the observer of that information. Indeed, the individual that's inside the head. And of course, these are the million-dollar questions that Gnostics have asked for centuries. What is the true nature of reality? Now, in terms of modern Gnosticism, I know that there are many modern Gnostic movements, and I'm wondering again if you could, from your point of view, give us an overview of what modern Gnosticism is, what groups are involved in it, and indeed your ideas or interpretations of the things that are actually going on now. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I think I was the Archon who turned on the mute button. It was my
the
turn.
Archon twins. Yeah. Miguel and Tony, the Archon twins. Got a link.
They're working through us now, yes. So, Okay, I should say that, again, Gnosticism was more of a metaphysical orientation. It was a philosophical attitude. So what mattered was the experience of gnosis. That's really the central thing, which is, again, making contact, as you would say, with your daemon and understanding that the world is an illusion, and how you're going to break away from this illusion and those who control you in different aspects of your life and different aspects of culture. So what the Gnostics did is they basically had, as one scholar said, everything but the kitchen sink approach. They were going to utilize everything that was around them to reach these ecstatic states. It didn't matter if it was Egyptian magic, Catholic sacraments, meditation, Greek contemplation, Babylonian rites and astrology, even sex magic. They definitely delved into that. They were going to find a way to reach through testing, because even the Gnostics in some texts talked about, science is essential. Test everything. Through a lot of testing and a lot of education, they were going to reach these ecstatic states. So I would say to the modern Gnostic, nothing has really changed. You're looking for the experience and how you can get that experience. And for everybody is different, right? I mean, you might maybe it's ayahuasca with a Santo Daime group like I did before. Maybe it's meditation. Maybe it's, again, going to a Catholic or Greek Orthodox and eating the host and doing a lot of prayer. Maybe it's a combination of things. The Gnostics were lambasted because they did tend to run into different circles. They had their own lodges, what they were doing, their own mystery rites, and sort of mix and match, very much like your modern day chaos magician would do. And so it really comes down to the experience of what's going to work for you. I mean, somebody like Philip K. Dick, he had his own ways of suddenly reaching the pleroma. Somebody like Carl Jung too, or William Burroughs. So there are Gnostic groups today. There are Gnostic churches. They wear, you might say, the sacramental Catholic garb, but they practice a lot of things behind the scenes, magic, meditation, everything. Again, it's all about what experience you can get, what can you test and try to get that. Obviously, to be a modern Gnostic, you have to reach certain conclusions, and that is the conclusions, of Philip K. Dick. What did Philip K. Dick say? Simon Magus lives. I am too much into Gnosticism to ever get out. He says that in his exegesis. It's again, how is he finding that reality behind the reality and knowing that there is no turning back once you do that? So I'd say it's more of a sensibility or attitude to be a Gnostic group. It's not specifically, I need to join this or I need to join that. You don't have to be a Sufi or into the Kabbalah, but you can if you get that experience.
And what about your own writing on the subject? I know that you're an extremely talented writer. I know you've written quite a lot of material, and I know that you've also written science fiction novels. So there are two questions here. The first one is about your own writing and how you've approached this, but also your comment there about the Santa Dame and your own experiences with ayahuasca. I'm really intrigued to know a little bit more about that. So maybe you can explain the ayahuasca experiences and about the Santa Dame. Because being from a Portuguese background, you have a lot of links with Brazil and places like that as well. So that's intriguing. So if you can answer that one first and then take the opportunity to move on to your own writing, because I'm really intrigued about that, because we've never discussed this before, ever. So I'm really quite interested to know a little bit more about it, because I wrote about the Santa Dame in my book, The Infinite Minefield. So I'm particularly interested. You have me piqued, as it were.
I've got piqued. Good. Yes, it's almost like something I always forget to talk about in my life. I guess because the experience was so intense, and it's almost like my Eidolon or this matrix wants to make sure I forget about it. I mean, because that's the way the world works. We can only handle what we can handle. But this was oddly in 2006, and again, this was probably right after I had finished Valis. And a sort of my consciousness my horizons were expanding. And I went to Portugal, to the homeland, to Lisbon, and it was my uncle. He himself had gotten himself into a Santo Daime group. So he had been traveling to Brazil and not just practicing, but he was becoming sort of the shaman of the group. And he came back to Lisbon and opened his own chapter. And I knew nothing about it. In fact, I didn't even know what ayahuasca was or DMT at the time. And he asked me, do you want me to join into one of his rituals? And I said, sure. Okay. Yeah. What do you do? Well, we drink some tea and then we sing some songs and we dance. And I said, oh, well, that sounds like fun. That sounds like I'll kill an evening doing that. And lo and behold, I drank this really foul tasting black liquid. And I said, okay. And then before I knew it, I was tripping. But ayahuasca is not like acid, because it is like the worst trip you will ever have in your life. It's horrible. I mean, there's nothing good about it, but that's the beauty of it, because we're sitting and doing this intense dancing and chanting and all this stuff for hours and hours, and suddenly I am reliving every nightmare I've ever had. Every insecurity I've ever had is on steroids. Every fear I have is on Red Bull. But as you're doing these rituals, suddenly they make sense, because there's something about them that keep you grounded. Not that keep you grounded, but make you face these horrors. And before I knew it, I suddenly had my first, you might say, astral travel. It was so intense. I was in so much duress that I just left my body. And I found myself floating up beyond the heavens, beyond, I don't know where I was. And I saw, you might say, Abraxas, which was the name of, you might say, of this god above God, the alien god of the Gnostics, this sort of the ultimate consciousness, the source of all, but not exactly the kind of being you would want to see. I think Carl Jung said, to know Abraxas is to go mad. I guess you could even invoke Lovecraft with that, except Abraxas might be more benign. But I left my body, and what I saw was amazing. I still can't describe it, but what's fascinating is that you might say, well, you're having a hallucination. Fair enough. I mean, but at the time, my aunt, who had a broken leg, who was in her 60s and who was somewhere else, she had a premonition while I was leaving my body, and she had herself drive to this temple, this church where we are, and she ran into the church and grabbed me. And she was like, I knew if I didn't come, you weren't going to come back. And I was like, thank God. And my uncle was like, see this stuff? And I kept seeing these strange visions and other really odd coincidences. There was a time when there was no coincidence. There was something amazing. And I started continuing that summer. And when I go back, continuing on these Santo Daime with Santo Daime rituals. And they're incredible. I mean, they're terrifying, but the things you see and what you can work out are amazing. And it's funny, because in the interview we did, Anthony, you talked about how the shamans knew how to make it, and that's the first thing my uncle would tell me. He's like, no, you can't just make the tea. You've got to get this plant and this plant, and we've known, and and he would tell me the patriarchs of Santo Daime, Irenaeus, and these other guys, who the plants spoke to them and told them how to mix the plants, how to write the songs. I mean, everything was very organic, and it's really big in Brazil. I mean, you have giant rituals where you have hundreds of people, and little kids are drinking Santo Daime. It's part of their weekly life, and these people are so much the better for it. So I'd say it's been amazing. So as for the books, I don't think I can top that. Yes, I've been a writer all my life. I've published a few books like The Queen of Darkness and Heretic and The Executioner's Daughter. And the funny thing is that they have, like my novel, The Queen of Darkness, which I republished, A Stargazer, is extremely Gnostic. And it was long before I knew about Gnosticism, and it's also very self-fulfilling. What do they say? All fiction is autobiographical. And sometimes you can predict yourself in it. It is about a sort of it's in the future where the vampires have arisen and they have taken over the world. They created all these nuclear explosions, and suddenly through the ashes they build these city-states, much like in ancient Greece, except they're technocratic advanced cities, and they've corralled all the humans, and now they feed on the humans. And again, this is the whole Gnostic model, because just like the Matrix or the Archons of the Gnostic myths, they feed off of our divine spark, our essence. In the novel, they feed off of the human blood, but they later find out that it's really our souls. And the Gnostic slant gets deeper, because the leader of the vampires, Lilith, I guess she is the demiurge character, although even in some Gnostic myths, Sophia is seen as evil. The Mandeans saw Sophia as an evil figure. That's how they're always turning things upside down. She makes sure that all the vampires forget that they were actually originally humans, that they're simply a separate species, that they are gods. So then they don't have any conscience about feeding off humans, kind of like we do. If we think animals are simply lesser forms of life or little machines or don't have souls or consciousness, then it's easy to eat them, right? So that's what happens. And of course, there's one vampire who wakes up, one vampire who creates a rebellion. So it's a story like that. In all my fiction, it has sort of that slant. In fact, something I wanted to mention is for the viewers, if you get a chance, there's a new series called Westworld that has come out based on the old one with the Yul Brynner, which I immensely enjoyed as a kid. But this goes full on Gnostic. So I would definitely watch it if I were you. And it reminds me a lot of your ideas and the eternal return, Anthony, because in the Westworld, obviously the androids are the ones that are going to start waking up. They're the ones that are being used by humans in this Western to be shot, to be used as prostitutes, to be part of their little games. And then, of course, they begin to wake up. But in the Westworld, they all wake every day. These androids go through their roles as a sheriff or a prostitute or a rancher every day, and then the next day they're rebooted and they start the same day again because new tourists are coming into Westworld. So they have the same lives, but suddenly some of these androids start understanding that they had past lives, that they're stuck in the same life, and they start wondering, how do I break out of this eternal return? So I thought you would find it fascinating, Anthony.
Interestingly enough, somebody contacted me on this on Facebook yesterday and said, I really need to see this TV series. Now, over the years, there have been so many TV series that have brought together a lot of the ideas and everything else. So this is intriguing. Now, I've just got a message now from our producer, Dia Nunez, down in Denver, and she'd like to join us for a second because she'd like to join in. So by all means, Dia, come on in.
I just have to say one thing, Miguel. You blew my mind when you said that because you know that I am a priestess and I am a shaman, and the fact that you took that journey of that drink and had no idea, and you came back. There are many stories that my elder has spoken of, and I have connection with not only elders in my tradition, but from all over the globe in many different traditions, because we're all one family. It's just a different door. You just gained 1,000,000 points from me. You had a lot before, but my God, because I've heard stories of people going there for spiritual purposes, for entertainment purposes, and they literally cannot be pulled back into this reality because the doorway that you go through is so profound and so deep. And it's funny that you use the word hallucination, but what is really a hallucination? It's actually a key to another realm of reality that is being shown to you. But because we have been indoctrinated from the hegemony, the mainstream world, we're made to believe that we're crazy when in fact we're actually seeing another aspect of reality. So you blew my mind, and that's all I have to say. I was hollering in the background. I was like, what?
Well, in a way it's very frustrating because I've had experiences like that, and even on Santo Daime, but they're very rare. And again, you read Philip K. Dick, he had his 2374, or Carl Jung in his Red Book, or I think that's with humans, and I think that's what Anthony argues. The doors of perception do open, but we still don't know when, and we don't know, and we're stuck with all this data or this experience trying to make sense of it for the rest of our lives. I mean, I always admire somebody like Socrates who could, on a whim, go on a mystical experience, and he said he could talk to his daemon every day at any moment. That's how advanced he was. So I'm blessed. I'm glad I had that experience, but part of me is like, I wish I could have it every day. But then again, who would watch the kids? Who would watch this dog, right?
And that is the major question, isn't it? And I've said this because I'm doing many, many interviews at the moment to do with the promotion of my new book. And it is one of the deepest questions of all, isn't it? That if we all became awake, as it were, to realize that this is some form of simulation, as Philip K. Dick did in 2374 and everything else, the world would cease to function, because we'd all just go into this kind of state of saying, well, it's not really real. Well, it is real, because it's an egregore. It's a created world that we all are observers of, and it brings it into its own reality. And as such, we have to live within this creation for a period of time whenever we are embodied within this environment. And I suppose, are we supposed to be aware, and this is a question that's been playing on my mind for quite a long time now, that are we supposed to be aware of the fact that it is a simulation, like, again, the Westworld analogy, the idea of the androids becoming aware of the fact that they're in this kind of time loop and they're living the same day over and over again. It's like Connors in Groundhog Day. Do you take the opportunity? What happens here? And I know, and I will strongly advise the people who listen and watch this program to really check up an awful lot of Miguel's interviews, because Miguel has a fantastic amount of background material of the people that he has interviewed over the years. I mean, Jeff Kripal is a classic example of this, and lots of other people who really can give a very, very powerful picture of an alternate logic, an alternate intellectual viewpoint on the world, which to me is profoundly exciting and profoundly important. And I'm just a very small cog in all this. And we're in a very exciting time, I think. We're also in a very dangerous time, because the world seems to be running rapidly out of control. And it seems that we've lost all sense or rationality anymore as to what we really want out of this planet. And I don't quite know what the answers are. I really don't. But I think individuals like ourselves at least are trying to seek out answers. And I think in that way it's successful. Now, we're coming towards the end, Miguel. So can you let the readers, the listeners, the viewers, I never know what to call the people out there really, to how they can contact you and your websites and everything else and various other bits and pieces. Just how can you get in touch with this surrogate Eddie Vedder, this Gnostic Eddie Vedder?
Oh dear, even flow. Well, first, I wanted to say also, I think the key to this is sometimes people go, well, the Gnostics were taking these flights and I'm doing ayahuasca, but I think the idea is that they believe that they were turning to Christian bodhisattvas. They weren't just they've been accused, they just wanted to leave the world and that's it. No, they were not to be transformed. At the end of the day, just to be kind to each other, just to be better people. That was part of the experience and touching the alien god. So I think the key to really hasn't changed. I think is we just have to be nicer to one another as the doors of perception open and we start managing these things and managing our daemons. So I think that's the key. And God knows I always want to go for the astral flight instead of just being nice to the cat in the alley or something like that, which is probably more powerful in the universe, more archon destructive, is that I be nice to a lost kitten than I go on an astral flight. But for information on the site is called thegodabovegod.com. Again, The God Above God, or you can just type in my name, Miguel Connor, on Google or Aeon Byte, and that is sort of the platform of my books, my articles, the podcasts. You can get access to all the podcasts I've done for the last 10 years. Wonderful guests like Anthony and again Jeff Kripal, Gary Lockman, and Andrew Philip Smith, and so many others. And again, you can find information about the book. If you want to understand about Gnosticism, I recommend my book, Voices of Gnosticism, which has transcripts of some of the best scholars in the world on the topic, including Bart Ehrman, Elaine Pagels, Karen King, and so forth. And I should announce, this is probably the first time it's going to be announced, that the sequel, Other Voices, is going to come out probably in November, published by Bardic Press from Andrew Philip Smith. And that one will have more transcripts. It's going to deal with the more historical movement of Gnosticism. You'll have interviews with Gary Lockman, Eric Davis, who is one of the editors for the Exegesis, Richard Smoley, and many others. So I think you'll enjoy it. So here it is, announced for the first time.
Wow, that's really fantastic. Because, again, the regular listeners on this show, we've had Gary Lackman on. We have had Andrew Philip Smith on as well, and now yourselves. And we did try to get Eric Davis. I met Eric about 2 years ago in London, and we had hoped to get him on the show, but the Archons attacked, and it never really happened. But I will try and revisit that, because I think Eric would make an excellent guest.
Oh, he's wonderful. He's wonderful, yeah.
I'd also like to get Jeff Crapel on, because Jeff was going to be writing a synopsis, sort of an analysis of my new book as well. But unfortunately, he had problems, ironically enough, again with his dog, and his dog got really ill, and he couldn't fulfill it. So I will try and recontact him. Okay, well, thank you again, Miguel. Thank you for joining me. Really wonderful chatting to you. And as always, Dia Nunez in the background there, beavering away, making sure that everything happens. And as I said, all these interviews now are being uploaded onto my new website, and they will all be there historically for people to have a look at. And until next month, when we'll have another guest, all the best, and thank you very much to everybody for listening in and everything else, and thank you.
Thank you.